type orchids want to grow in a very loose, open potting medium. We tend to like either fir bark or a mixture of fir bark with a little bit of something called core, which is coconut fiber, or sometimes you mix a little bit of perlite, a little bit of charcoal, things like that. But this is the potting medium of choice for most epiphytic orchids. You sometimes will see them also just grown in pure sphagnum moss. I find that they don't make as big a root system in sphagnum as they do in the bark mixes, so I usually prefer the bark. Other people will grow them, if you go to Hawaii, most of them will be grown in pure lava sand, just chunks of lava they grow in. But the potting medium is just a substrate for them to grow in, because like I say, in nature, their roots would not be growing in anything. They'd just be crawling over the bark of trees or just hanging out in the air. So the potting medium is basically just to anchor them and to hold them in the pot. And it needs to be loose, it needs to be open. Probably the greatest danger is, over time, the greatest danger to the life of the plant is the potting medium begins to rot and break down, and that's why it's important that you repot these things periodically. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But yes.
With her orchid, if you cut one of the roots and pot it, will it create another orchid?
Cut roots? No. It will not make a new orchid. We'll talk more about that specific plant in just a few minutes. That is a phalaenopsis, and sometimes they do that. Some types of orchids will make new plants up on the bloom spike. That can sometimes be both a good and bad sign. But no, if you cut a root, all you have is a cut root. You're not going to get anything else out of it. You can't grow them from cutting, so to speak. But the great majority of the orchids that you're likely to buy and grow as a house or greenhouse plant are going to be epiphytes. It includes the phalaenopsis, it includes the oncidiums, it includes epidendrums, dendrobiums, vandas, ascoscendas, things like that. Those are all epiphytic orchids. The second group of orchids is what we refer to as terrestrial orchids, which in nature actually grow down on the ground, in soil. Now, they don't grow in heavy clay, mud soils, things like that. They grow in soils that have a lot of organic material in them, that are fairly loose, fairly open, but they're actually growing in the soil. There are three kinds of orchids that I want to mention that you'll find growing that way. The cymbidiums, which is this plant right here, and these are the ones you see around Easter and Mother's Day that tend to put up the spikes, those little corsages that you get around this time of year. Those are probably cymbidium blooms. In California, they grow these things as plants out in the yard. Here in Texas, they won't take a hard freeze. They'll take 30 degrees without a problem. In fact, it helps them bloom better if they get chilled. But they are terrestrial orchids. The Paphiopedilums, used to call them lady sliver orchids, but you know, that's too easy a word, so they had to change the name to Paphiopedilum. Anyway, these things are terrestrial orchids that grow in the soil. There is one type of orchid that will actually grow in our hill country soil, and that is this little orchid right here. These are called blatillas, or Chinese ground orchids, and they are actually a true orchid. And if you have I'd amend your soil with some compost and things, but you can plant these in a shady area in your yard. They'll freeze down in the winter. In the spring, they come up and put up a bunch of foliage that's about this tall. Roberta has these growing in her yard. She's got an area, well, she's got an outside stairway, and there's a shady bed underneath. And she probably has, most springs, she'll have 1,000 flowers on those little clumps. They make the spike about this tall. Little flowers are about this big around. But
they also known as the little bamboo orchid?
No, bamboo orchid is something different that grows in Hawaii. These are called Chinese ground orchids, and the common name on them is Blatilla. This lavender form is by far the most common. The white form is a little bit rarer, but very, very easy to grow. And if you've got a shady spot outside in relatively good soil and you want to grow an orchid in the ground, you can actually grow these. There are a couple of places down at San Antonio Botanical Gardens where there are fairly big clumps of these come out every year in bloom. But these are the orchids which are known as terrestrial orchids, and obviously those we can plant in a much heavier mix. But know which is which, because if you put that kind of orchid in potting soil, it's not going to live very long. If you put these, or the Cymbidium in a really loose mix, it's going to dry out, too quickly and not do well. So understand where the orchids would grow in nature. Now, one other thing that I will tell you a little bit about culture on orchids. Watering is probably the most critical thing if you're going to grow orchids well. And there are two general growth habits, we might say, with orchids. One is a type of orchid which has no water storage structure. There's nothing here on this plant other than the leaves or on the roots. There's no way that this plant really can store water. Same thing's true on this Paphiopedilum right here. You don't have any water storage organ. So this type of orchid, when you water them, you want to water them very, very thoroughly. When the potting medium is dry on the surface, you want to water them thoroughly again. You should not let this kind of orchid dry out, or it simply will not grow as well. There are other orchids, however, like these Oncidium types, which form a big fat structure like this. This is called a pseudobulb, or a false bulb. That's what you're looking at on this Cymbidium right here. These big fat structures right here. And these are water storage organs. So if you're growing a type of orchid that forms a pseudobulb, they probably want to get a little bit drier between waterings. In nature, these tend to come from areas that have a wet season and a dry season. The pseudobulb allows them to hold moisture for a time when the rains aren't as common. But if you see an orchid with a pseudobulb, let it get a little bit drier, let it dry out a little bit further through the pot, even though you probably don't want to let it get bone dry. By the way, if you're smelling a very, very sweet smell, this is probably what you're smelling. This is a type of orchid called, it's an Oncidium. This particular species, or this particular hybrid, happens to be called Sherry Baby. Want to smell that? Smell that and tell me how fragrant that is. Is that not one of the sweetest smelling things you've ever seen? So some orchids are fragrant. Not all orchids are fragrant, but many orchids are very fragrant. Interestingly enough, lots of the ones that have yellow flowers smell like lemons, and others, they have almost no fragrance at all. To tell you what a highly evolved group of plants they are, there's some orchids that are so specialized that they'll only be fragrant at certain hours of the day. There's a little orchid down in Mexico called Brassavola nodosa that happens to be pollinated by a night-flying moth. And I'm not going to say these things consciously know this, but the evolution over time, they somehow have figured out that why waste all your fragrance during the day if the guy that pollinates you is not going to come along till nightfall. At nightfall, this particular orchid becomes so fragrant that one or two flowers in an area this size would be so sweet smelling it probably would drive you out of the area. The common name of this orchid is the Lady of the Night orchid. Now, I won't go there, but it's called the Brassavola nodosa, but it smells kind of like a very, very fragrant perfume, shall we say. And others, like I say, have almost no scent at all. To tell you once again how highly evolved these orchids are, there is one little Oncidium that grows down in the Caribbean area that actually releases a fragrance that smells like one of the female hormones of a given type of bee. And the way that this orchid gets pollinated is when Mr. Bee comes flying by, smells like what smells like a female bee, the little thing flutters in the breeze, actually looks kind of like a female bee, and Mr. Male Bee goes down with something other than just flying around on his mind, whams into this orchid, and that's how the orchid gets pollinated. So it's a very interesting and diverse, complex group of plants.